The bead shop appeared like a mirage through the French Quarter mist, wedged between Lafitte's and an abandoned tobacco store. I'd walked this stretch of Royal Street 3 times that day, hunting for the perfect reference photos for my architecture blog. My latest post about hidden Creole courtyards had gone viral last week, and my editor at the Times-Picayune had finally offered me that regular column. Secret Histories of the French Quarter. It would have been my first steady paycheck since moving here 6 years ago after Gran's funeral. She'd always told me stories about the city's mysteries, made me promise to keep them alive. The narrow storefront with its weathered cypress door hadn't existed until now, just after sunset on Mardi Gras. I knew it hadn't, because I'd been photographing every historic doorway on this block since morning, trying to calm my nerves about tomorrow's meeting with the editor. Yet here it was, as if it had grown out of the fog itself. A brass bell chimed overhead as I entered, my camera heavy around my neck. The air inside hung thick with incense and decay, like lilies left too long in stagnant water. The same flowers Gran used to place on her ancestor's tomb in St. Louis Cemetery No. 1. Strands of antique glass beads draped every surface, catching what little light filtered through the grimy windows. Their colors seemed wrong somehow. Too deep, too alive. After 5 years of documenting New Orleans' hidden corners, of trying to understand why Gran had been so insistent I come here after she was gone, I thought I'd seen every shop in the quarter. Clearly, I was wrong. An elderly woman emerged from behind a black velvet curtain. Her elaborate carnival mask, crafted from dark leather and adorned with raven's feathers, covered everything except her mouth. Something about her presence made my hands shake, the same way they had when I'd found Gran's last letter, the one warning me about doors that hadn't been there before. "Welcome, child." Her lips barely moved. "You've come for something special." My fingers traced a strand of beads that seemed to pulse with an inner light. "I'm just looking," I lied, already composing the blog post in my head. Local finds, French Quarter's hidden treasures, the kind of puff piece that would pay the rent but never reveal the real stories, the ones Gran had tried to tell me before the cancer took her. The woman's red-painted lips curved upward. "These belonged to the first Rex parade in 1872. She lifted the strand, and the beads clinked together with an almost musical sound. Purple for justice, green for faith, red for power. The true colors of Carnival, before the tourists came with their plastic trinkets." Her head tilted slightly. "Your grandmother would have understood." My heart stopped. "I never mentioned. You didn't have to, dear. I can see her in you. That same hunger to know the city's real face, to tell its true stories. She almost succeeded, you know, almost exposed things that should stay hidden." The woman's smile widened. "But you'll do better, won't you? You'll see everything she tried to warn you about." "How much?" The words tumbled out before I could stop them, Gran's warning letter burning in my back pocket like a brand. Her teeth gleamed in the shadows. "For you? A gift?" She draped the beads around my neck. They felt heavy, cold against my skin, like the weight of unfinished business. "Wear them tonight when the parades roll. See what they show you. See what your grandmother tried to tell you." I reached for my wallet anyway, a freelance writer's guilt kicking in. I can't just... But when I looked up, the woman had vanished behind the curtain. I called out, but only silence answered. The bell chimed again as I hurried outside, the beads still around my neck. Later that night, I stood among the crowd on St. Charles Avenue as the Proteus parade approached. The ancient Krewe flambeau carriers illuminated the street with their traditional gas flames, casting dramatic shadows across the Victorian mansions I'd spent countless hours photographing and researching. The ornate galleries and wraparound porches that usually charmed my blog readers now seemed to loom menacingly, their decorative ironwork twisting into grotesque shapes in the flickering light. A float bearing a crowned figure drew near, and I reached up to catch more beads out of habit, wondering if I'd ever look at these historic facades the same way again. My fingers brushed against the antique strand, and the world shifted. Suddenly, I was no longer on St. Charles. The heavy fabric of a ball gown constrained my movements, and I could smell gardenias and champagne. Arnaud's restaurant materialized around me, but not as I knew it. Gas lamps cast a yellow glow over the dining room, and men in formal attire raised their glasses to a figure I couldn't quite see. "All hail the Queen of Carnival, 1918. The words echoed as if underwater. My chest tightened. No, her chest tightened. I was seeing through someone else's eyes, feeling her mounting panic as the bodice of her gown constricted further. The room spun. The gardenia's scent became overwhelming, cloying. She tried to call for help, but no sound emerged. The other revelers continued their celebrations, oblivious to her distress. Darkness crept in at the edges of her vision. Our vision. Through the spots dancing before her eyes, I saw the same masked woman from the shop, standing in the corner, watching. Not aged a day. Then everything went black. When my vision cleared, I was on my knees on the neutral ground, retching into the grass. A concerned couple stopped to help me up. The woman patted my arm. "Too much to drink, honey?" I shook my head, unable to explain. The parade continued rolling past, but now each float seemed menacing, each masked rider a harbinger of something terrible. I reached for the beads, meaning to rip them off, but my fingers passed through them as if they were made of smoke. The night stretched before me, endless, and I knew with bone-deep certainty that this was only the beginning. Each bead held a story, a death, a piece of Carnival's dark history, and somehow I had to see them all. My hands itched for my camera, my reporter's notebook. This was it, the story that would make my career. The editor would flip when I showed them what really happened behind Carnival's glittering facade. The crowd pressed in around me as I stumbled away from St. Charles Avenue. My fingers kept grasping at the beads, but they remained ghostly, untouchable, even as I felt their weight growing heavier around my neck. The sounds of the parade, brass bands, screaming revelers, the crunch of beads under feet, became a distant roar. I ducked into an alley, pressing my forehead against the cool, aged brick that I normally would have stopped to photograph and document. These narrow passages between buildings were some of the quarter's oldest surviving structures, their bricks still bearing the maker's marks from the 1700s. But now I could only think about how many horrors these walls had witnessed. A father and daughter passed by the entrance, their faces distorted by cheap plastic masks. "Throw me something, mister!" the girl shouted, her voice echoing unnaturally off the historic masonry. Another bead brushed against my collarbone, and reality fractured again. Heat assaulted my senses first. Overwhelming, suffocating heat. I was holding a heavy torch, its flames casting wild shadows across the crowd. The weight of it pulled at muscles that weren't mine, in arms longer and stronger than my own. Through his eyes, because I was certainly seeing through a man's perspective now, I watched the crowd part before me like a dark sea. "Keep moving!" a voice hissed beside me. "The parade can't stop!" But something was wrong. The flames were too high, too hungry. I could feel them licking closer, even as we continued our slow march down the street. The handle of the flambeau was slick with sweat in my borrowed hands. In the crowd, I saw her again. The masked shopkeeper, watching with those same unblinking eyes. The flames leaped higher, caught the sleeve of my shirt. Someone screamed. The torch fell. I came back to myself retching again, this time behind a dumpster. The taste of smoke lingered in my mouth, though the night air was cool and damp. When I wiped my face, my hands came away wet with tears I didn't remember crying. An old man smoking nearby spoke without looking at me. "First Mardi Gras?" I laughed, the sound bordering on hysteric. "You could say that." He took a long drag from his cigarette. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "More than one." I pushed myself up, using the wall for support. The beads clinked together mockingly. His eyes fixed on them, widening slightly. He crushed out his cigarette with deliberate slowness. "Where did you get those?" "A shop on Royal?" I swallowed hard. But when I went back, it wasn't there. Of course it wasn't. He stepped closer, and I noticed a pin on his jacket, a small skull wearing a crown. Some shops only appear when they're hunting. Before I could ask what he meant, drums began pounding in the distance. The old man's head snapped up. "Dawn's coming. The North Side Skull and Bone Gang will be starting their walk." He grabbed my arm, his grip surprisingly strong. "If you want to survive until tomorrow, you better come with me." Behind us, the drums grew louder, and I swore I could hear Bon as rattling in time with their beat. My feet moved without conscious thought, following the old man through a maze of service alleys. The drum beats seemed to come from everywhere now, vibrating in my chest like a second heartbeat. Each step made the beads bounce against my throat, threatening another vision. "I'm Thomas." The old man wove through the shadows with practiced ease. "Been with the Bone Gang 40 years. Another bead brushed my skin, and the world tilted. This time I was dancing, my feet moving to a jazz funeral dirge. The year felt older, perhaps 1890s. My borrowed hands held a black parasol trimmed with jet beads. Through the mesh veil attached to my hat, I watched the procession wind through the quarter. Children darted between the mourners, snatching up the coins scattered for their ancestors. But something was wrong with the coins. As the children touched them, their skin began to blacken and peel. One by one they collapsed, their faces contorting in agony. The music never stopped. The dancers never stopped. Through it all, the masked woman stood in a doorway, collecting the children's souls like butterflies in a jar. "Keep walking." Thomas's voice pulled me back. Blood ran down my chin where I'd bitten through my lip. The visions get stronger near dawn. That's when the veil's thinnest. We emerged onto St. Augustine Church's front steps. I'd written about this building just last month, the oldest African-American Catholic church in the country, its walls holding 2 centuries of prayers and music. Now those same walls seemed to absorb the sound of approaching drums. A group of men in skeleton costumes had gathered there, their faces painted with intricate skull designs that seemed to shift in the pre-dawn light. They moved with an unsettling grace across the worn stone steps I'd so carefully photographed and documented, rattling bones and chanting, "You next! You next!" These beads, I touched them gingerly. They're showing me deaths, carnival deaths. Thomas nodded, his own skull paint seeming to sink deeper into his skin. Every year she collects more souls, traps them in those pretty glass beads of hers, feeds off their suffering like a spider with flies in her web. The shopkeeper? We call her the Carnival Keeper. He led me toward the skull-faced men, and I noticed their bone rattles weren't props. They were real finger bones, yellowed with age. Been here since before the first Mardi Gras, since before New Orleans was even a city. The first French settlers found her here, trading glass beads to the natives for pieces of their souls. The drums reached a crescendo as the sun's first rays touched the church's cross. One of the skeleton men stepped forward, removing his hat. His skull paint seemed to move in the early light, as if the bones beneath his skin were trying to emerge. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of centuries. "Our people," he said, touching the bones at his belt. "We knew her kind before the Europeans came. Soul stealers, dream eaters, the ones who dance between worlds. Our ancestors formed the first Bone Gang to fight her, to wake the city each Mardi Gras morning before she could claim more victims, to remind people that death walks among them." He looked at Thomas. "Your grandmother was one of us, child. One of our strongest." My head snapped up. "Gran? Why do you think she wanted you here?" Thomas's eyes were kind behind his skull paint. "She almost stopped the Keeper 20 years ago. Would have if the cancer hadn't taken her first. But she knew you'd come. Knew you had the sight, same as her. So..." The lead skeleton man's voice drew my attention back. "The Keeper's hunting again, and this time she chose the wrong soul to steal." He traced a symbol in the air with his bone wand, and I recognized it. The same symbol Gran used to draw on our doorway every carnival season. "Your grandmother bought these bones from Marie Laveau herself to fight the Keeper's magic. We've been waiting for someone who could finish what she started." The beads grew hot against my skin, and I knew the next vision would be the worst yet. Dawn had come, and with it, my time was running out. The skeleton man traced a symbol in the air with what looked like real human finger bones. "Each bead is a soul." His paint shifted again, revealing glimpses of actual bone beneath. "And you've got 9 more deaths to witness before the sun clears the horizon." My knees buckled. I can't see anymore." "You must." Thomas gripped my shoulders. Each vision weakens her hold. The souls need a witness to their passing, someone to share their final moments. It's the only way to set them free. The next bead ignited against my skin like a hot coal. I was running through the quarter, my feet slipping on wet cobblestones. The year was 1927, and floodwaters from the Mississippi were rising. The man whose eyes I saw through clutched a mask made of hammered gold, a Comus treasure stolen from their den. Behind me, masked figures gave chase, their carnival attire transformed into something sinister by the storm. The water rose faster now, neck deep in places. Lightning revealed the Carnival Keeper standing on a balcony above, her mask gleaming. She pointed, and the masked figures moved faster, their hands becoming claws, their fine clothes melting into scales. The floodwaters pulled at my borrowed legs. The gold mask dragged me down. As dark water filled my lungs, I saw hundreds of other souls trapped beneath the surface, their faces pressed against a watery window, forever drowning in that eternal Mardi Gras night. Breathe. The skeleton man's painted face filled my vision as I gasped back to consciousness. 7 more to go. Dawn painted the sky in shades of purple, green, and red. The Bone Gang formed a circle around me, their chants growing more urgent. Each rattle of their bones matched the rhythm of my heart. The Keeper's getting stronger, Thomas warned. Can you feel her pulling? I nodded, unable to speak. Something was tugging at my essence, trying to draw me into the beads. The next vision was already starting, the edges of reality blurring. Fight it, the skeleton man commanded. Remember, you're not just watching, you're setting them free. The world spun again as another bead claimed me, promising more horrors in the growing light of Fat Tuesday's dawn. The next vision slammed into me like a physical blow. Suddenly, I was in an ornate courtyard, 1932, watching through the eyes of a young debutante as she leaned against a wrought iron railing. The balcony was packed with revelers, their weight making the ancient bolts creak. She noticed, of course she noticed, but didn't want to seem hysterical in front of the others. The Keeper stood in the crowd below, tilting her head up at just the wrong angle, like a bird studying prey. A sharp crack split the air. Time stretched like pulled taffy as the railing gave way. I felt her fingers scramble for purchase on nothing but air, felt the sickening moment of weightlessness. The fall lasted forever. The impact lasted longer. I came up gasping, but another bead was already burning. 1945. I was raising a champagne glass with trembling hands, tasting bitter almonds underneath the bubbles. The crew captain's ball spun around me in dizzying circles of color and sound. My heart was racing too fast, then too slow. Across the room, the Keeper raised her own glass in a mocking toast as my organs began to shut down one by one. The next bead dragged me to 1957. Cool brass pressed against my lips as I lifted a trumpet for a solo. The crowd at Preservation Hall fell silent, waiting. But something was wrong with the music pouring from my horn. Notes that shouldn't exist, sounds that shouldn't be possible. They ripped through me like razor wire, shredding something vital. My lungs turned to steel wool. My blood became molten brass. Still, I couldn't stop playing. The Keeper conducted from the shadows, and the song of my death echoed off the ancient walls. Each time I surfaced, the circle of skeleton men grew tighter, their bone rattling more frantic. Their chants took on an edge of desperation. "She's coming," Thomas hissed. The sky had turned the color of a fresh bruise. The remaining beads pulsed against my throat like dying heartbeats. Before the next vision could take me, I saw her, the Keeper, gliding across the street toward us, her mask now showing its true form, a twisted thing of bone and darkness. "Those souls are mine!" Her voice echoed from everywhere and nowhere. "Take the last visions now!" The skeleton man pressed something into my palm, a piece of graveyard dirt wrapped in a scrap of purple cloth. "All at once!" I clutched the dirt and plunged into the final horrors. 1891. The costume trunk's lid slammed shut with the weight of a tomb door. In the suffocating darkness, I clawed at the silk-lined walls until my fingers bled. Ghostly hands pressed me deeper into the mass of sequins and feathers. They whispered of an eternal masquerade as I slowly suffocated among the costumes of 100 carnivals past. 1903. Through the photographer's eyes, I watched the parade through his ancient camera's ground glass. But something was wrong with the image. The revelers' faces stretched and distorted, revealing what lurked beneath their masks. As I pressed the shutter, the flash powder ignited with unnatural intensity. The last thing I saw was the Keeper's TR, face, burning itself onto my retinas, onto the glass plate, onto my soul. 1964. The crown descended onto my head in a mockery of coronation. Each jewel became a thorn, piercing deeper with every heartbeat. The ballroom's mirrors showed my reflection crowned in blood. The Keeper approached with a scepter made of bones, promising an eternal reign in her court of shadows. 1985. I adjusted my float rider's mask, but something was wrong. The leather grew soft, alive. It began to melt, to fuse with my skin. I tried to scream, but my new face wouldn't allow it. The crowd below cheered as I thrashed, as my real face dissolved beneath the mask's hungry embrace. The Keeper walked alongside the float, collecting my identity like just another strand of beads. The Keeper's rage tore through the visions like hurricane winds. "You cannot free them! They are my sustenance, my eternal masquerade!" But I wasn't alone anymore. The souls I'd witnessed gathered around me. The flambeau carrier, the drowning thief, the debutante, all of them. Their combined presence gave me strength to endure that final vision. Dawn broke over St. Augustine Church as the last soul tore free from its glass prison. The Bone Gang's chants reached a fever pitch. I felt the graveyard dirt in my hand turn to fire as I flung it at the Keeper. She screamed, a sound like carnival floats collapsing and ancient crypts cracking. Her mask shattered, revealing a void where a face should be. The freed souls swirled around her like a second-line parade from hell, each one taking a piece of her power as they ascended. "This changes nothing." Her voice faded like fog burning off the Mississippi. "There will always be another tourist, another strand of beads, another dark Mardi Gras night." She dissolved into morning mist, leaving only the echo of mad laughter. The skeleton men helped me stand. Their painted faces had returned to normal, though I swore I could still see death lingering behind their eyes. The rising sun caught the ancient bones at their belts, centuries of offerings from those they'd saved, willingly given in exchange for protection. "The shop will return next carnival season," Thomas said, brushing graveyard dirt from my shoulders. "And the next, and the next." I touched my throat where the beads had been. "Why didn't you destroy her completely?" The skeleton man who'd led the ritual shook his head. "Light needs shadow, life needs death, and carnival needs its darkness." He pressed a small skull pin into my palm, carved from human bone, like Gran's had been. "Someone has to remember the city's true face. Someone has to know what lurks behind the masks. We'll need you next year, when she finds another victim. The cycle never ends." I recognized the words. They were the same ones Gran had written in her final letter. Looking at the skull pin, I finally understood why she'd spent her life documenting the city's secret histories, why she'd trained me to do the same. Someone had to remember. Someone had to witness. And now that role was mine. I walked home through streets already filling with Fat Tuesday revelers. Their plastic beads glittered in the morning sun, catching on the cast-iron balconies I'd spent years studying and admiring. My blog would never mention the shop. Some histories shouldn't be documented. Some architectural mysteries better left unsolved. But I wondered how many tourists would wander down that forgotten alley next year, drawn by the gentle chime of a brass bell and the glitter of ancient glass beads, never suspecting that the real story of New Orleans architecture wasn't in the buildings themselves, but in the spaces that appeared between them, in the shadows of a city that refused to be fully mapped. Above me, the sky had turned a perfect carnival morning blue, but I knew better now. Night would come again, and with it, the hunger of the Keeper, collecting souls like beads on an endless strand.
I lowered my camera just long enough to flex my frozen fingers. 3 hours into my first real freelance assignment, and I was already questioning my decision to quit the newspaper. But rent was rent, and the French Quarter Tourism Board paid better than chasing police scanner calls ever had. They wanted candid shots of authentic Mardi Gras revelry, whatever that meant. The air was thick with the clash of brass bands, each competing crew trying to drown out the others. Below my borrowed balcony perch on Royal Street, the crowd swelled and churned like a human river, their upraised hands grasping at cheap plastic beads as if they were strands of pure gold. The sense of bourbon and crawfish boil drifted up from the crowd, mixing with sweet olive from the courtyard next door. Through my viewfinder, I'd caught at least a dozen shots that screamed authentic revelry. Drunk tourists stumbling over broken cobblestones, masked women twirling parasols beneath wrought iron balconies dripping with purple wisteria, a jazz band playing under centuries-old gas lamps that threw wild shadows across peeling French colonial paint. The sun had just set, and the French Quarter was transforming. String lights flickered to life along the balconies, and the crowd below grew rowdier as the night crews emerged, still wearing their cemetery tour guide badges and voodoo shop aprons. A woman in a sequined Marie Laveau costume tossed gold-painted palm readings into the crowd. This was the real New Orleans, the one that lived in the spaces between tourist traps and ghost stories. That's when I first saw him. The plague doctor mask gleamed dull brass under the streetlights, its curved beak casting knife-sharp shadows across the elaborate robes. He moved against the flow of the parade, weaving through the crowd with impossible grace. No one seemed to notice him. My camera clicked rapidly as I tracked his movement. Through my telephoto lens, I caught the glint of something metallic in his gloved hand. Not beads, but old coins. Doubloons. "Hey, mister, throw me something." A woman in a sequined dress pushed to the front of the crowd, her blonde hair catching the purple and gold lights. The masked figure turned toward her with a fluid motion that made my skin crawl. The doubloon arced through the air, spinning end over end, catching the light like a falling star. Her fingers closed around it. I caught the whole sequence, her triumphant smile, the way she held up her prize, and then something else. Something wrong. Lowering my camera, I checked the LCD screen. The woman stood frozen in the first shot, doubloon clutched to her chest. In the next frame, taken barely a second later, her edges had begun to blur. Third frame. Her form was translucent, the crowd visible through her body. Fourth frame. Empty space where she had stood, the crowd already filling in the gap like water rushing into a void. My hands shook as I looked back at the street. No sign of the blonde woman. No sign of the plague doctor either. A cold sweat broke out across my forehead despite the February chill. I rapidly thumbed through more photos, trying to convince myself I'd somehow screwed up the exposure or had a corrupt memory card. But every image was crystal clear, documenting the impossible with perfect digital precision. The screen cast a blue glow across my face as I zoomed in on the doubloon. Ancient symbols crawled across its surface, so intricate they seemed to move when I stared too long. My stomach lurched. Below, the crowd roared as another float approached. I raised my camera again, hands steadier now that I had purpose. If what I'd captured was real, I needed evidence. I needed to document everything. The viewfinder swept across the surging crowd until I spotted that brass mask again. The plague doctor stood motionless amid the chaos, head tilted up toward my balcony. Even through the mask's dark lenses, I could feel his gaze locked onto mine. He raised one gloved hand in greeting, metallic discs gleaming between his fingers. I pressed my eye tighter to the viewfinder and started shooting. The photos told a story that made my blood run cold. Every 23 minutes, the plague doctor would emerge from the crowd. Every appearance, another person vanished. Through my lens, I watched 3 more disappearances. A college student in a Saints jersey, an elderly man with Mardi Gras beads layered thick around his neck, a tourist clutching a hurricane glass. Each time the same terrible sequence. The catch, the smile, the fade. And each time the crowd kept dancing, kept laughing, kept reaching for the sky with beer-sticky hands. A woman dissolved into nothingness right next to a drumline, her final silent scream lost in their thundering rhythms. A man began to disappear while a nearby crew shouted, "Laissez les bon temps rouler." No one noticed the horror unfolding in their midst. The revelry swallowed everything. My fingers trembled as I zoomed in on a doubloon caught in mid-arc, glinting like fool's gold against a shower of cheap plastic beads and LED throwies. The symbols seemed different from the first one, yet somehow familiar, like letters in an alphabet I'd seen in a nightmare. Those symbols looked familiar. I'd seen them before, hadn't I? The memory hit me like a physical blow. Last week's research at the Museum of Death, helping Pete catalog artifacts from the 1857 yellow fever epidemic. The same intricate patterns had been etched into a collection of brass tokens, each one blackened with age. The plague doctor appeared again, right on schedule. This time, I captured a clear shot of his hands as he reached into his robes. The gloves weren't leather or fabric. They were made of tarnished brass or copper, each finger segmented like an antique clockwork toy. They moved with tiny clicking sounds, like the gears of a music box turning, and when he flexed them, I could see pistons and joints working beneath the metal surface. The fingers bent in too many places, their movements fluid yet fundamentally wrong, as if they were designed by someone who'd only read about human anatomy in books, just like in the museum's woodcuts of the bird-masked savior who'd appeared during the epidemic's darkest days. My hands trembled as I pulled up the museum's digital archives on my phone. The pieces were falling into place, each revelation worse than the last. City leaders, desperate to save their dying city. A mysterious figure promising salvation. A contract signed in haste, its true cost hidden in the fine print. I'd always wondered why the epidemic had ended so suddenly. The official death toll had been suspiciously neat too, exactly 166 souls less than all other historical projections had estimated. 166 souls. The significance of that number made my stomach lurch. I'd seen it repeated in the margins of the contract, written in those same crawling symbols. A payment schedule, Pete had called it. I did the math in my head. 1857 plus 166 years. Tonight. My camera nearly slipped from my grip. I'd counted 12 disappearances so far. How many had I missed before I started watching? Below, the plague doctor emerged again. He moved with new urgency now, his masked face turning from side to side as children laughed and parents hoisted them higher on their shoulders. Confetti rained down like bright snow, sticking to his dark robes. The crowd parted unconsciously around him, still oblivious to the horror in their midst, still singing along to "When the Saints Go Marching In" as he hunted among them. A nearby float's strobe lights caught his mask in stuttering flashes, making him seem to teleport through the celebrating masses. The contract's final clause flashed through my mind, translated in Pete's neat handwriting. Upon default, all souls spared by initial agreement become forfeit. The implications turned my blood to ice. Thousands of souls, not just those who died, but all their descendants, generations of lives that would have never existed without that bargain. And here they all were, dancing at the devil's parade. The plague doctor stopped, his mask tilted up toward a small boy perched on his father's shoulders, hands reaching toward the sky. Metallic fingers emerged from those dark robes, a doubloon catching the light. I didn't think. I moved. I vaulted over the balcony railing, catching a lamppost and sliding down like a deranged firefighter. My camera swung wildly from its strap. Pain shot through my palms, but I hit the crowd running. "Wait! Stop!" My voice was lost in the roar of the parade. The doubloon spun upward in terrible slow motion. The boy's small hands stretched toward it, his face glowing with innocent joy. I lunged through the press of bodies, shouldering people aside. My fingers closed around cold metal just inches from the child's grasp. Triumph surged through me, then turned to ice. The doubloon burned like frozen fire against my palm. I couldn't let go. A creeping numbness spread up my arm, and when I looked down, I could see the pavement through my own flesh. The plague doctor's mask tilted to one side. A sound emerged from behind it. Not laughter, but something older, like dry leaves scraping across ancient stones. He extended one metallic hand toward me, beckoning. The brass fingers unfurled with tiny whirs and clicks, moving in smooth, overlapping sequences, like the petals of some mechanical flower. Moonlight caught the edges where the metal plates overlapped, revealing intricate engravings that matched the symbols on the doubloons. Steam or smoke leaked from the joints, carrying a sharp metallic tang that burned my nostrils. No! I gasped, fighting the pull. My legs felt lighter, less substantial with each second. I didn't want this. I was saving him. The mask's dark lenses fixed on me. A voice like cemetery dust filled my head. The catch was willing. The contract is binding. But something clicked in my fading mind. The contract. Willing catches. I hadn't wanted the doubloon for myself. I'd only wanted to stop it. I forced my dissolving fingers to move. The doubloon's icy burn fought me, but I managed to shift my grip. With the last of my strength, I hurled it toward a storm drain. The plague doctor lunged, metal fingers grasping at empty air. The doubloon hit the grate with a musical ping and disappeared into the darkness below. Sensation flooded back into my body. I gasped as solidity returned, every nerve ending screaming back to life. Around me, the crowd continued their oblivious celebration, but the plague doctor stood frozen. A crack appeared in his brass mask, then another. Dark light leaked through the fissures. The crack spread, revealing not a face behind the mask, but a void filled with swirling shapes. Faces pressed against some invisible barrier, mouths open in silent screams. The mask shattered completely. I raised my camera on pure instinct and pressed the shutter as reality seemed to tear open. Through my viewfinder, I saw hundreds of transparent faces swirling in that impossible space, caught in an eternal moment of realizing what their willing catches had cost them. Their screams were silent, but their mouths stretched wide, a horrific counterpoint to the laughing revelers who danced just inches away, tossing beads and catching trinkets in the same air that had become a portal to damnation. Then the void collapsed in on itself, leaving nothing but a shower of Mardi Gras beads clattering to the pavement. Back in my apartment, I connected my camera to my laptop with trembling hands. The photos were still there, proof I hadn't imagined it all. The disappearances, the mask, that terrible void. I zoomed in on the final shot, stomach clenching at the desperate faces trapped in that cosmic nightmare. One face stood out, the blonde woman in the sequined dress, forever caught in the moment she realized her mistake. My phone buzzed, another text from Pete. Archives say contract must be fulfilled. No escaping the debt, only delayed. I closed my eyes, remembering those metallic fingers, that beckoning gesture. When I opened them, a new message waited. Found something else. Contract renews every sunset until quota met. The sound of water rushing through pipes made me freeze. I lived on the 4th floor, but I could hear it clearly. The gurgle of water in the storm drains below. Metal scraping against metal. The last photo on my screen caught something I hadn't noticed before. In the corner, barely visible, a glint of gold emerging from a storm drain grate. Not one doubloon, but dozens, carried up by unseen currents. I walked to my window. The sun was setting, painting the French Quarter in shades of blood and gold. Below, early revelers were already gathering for tonight's parades, hands raised to catch whatever might fall from the sky. A glint of brass caught my eye from the alleyway. The mask had reformed, newer and brighter than before. The plague doctor stood motionless, head tilted back to study my window. His metal fingers opened, revealing fresh doubloons that caught the dying light. The debt remained, the contract renewed, and somewhere in the gathering crowd, someone would make a willing catch. I raised my camera and started shooting. Not for the tourism board's puff piece anymore, but because someone had to bear witness. Someone had to preserve the evidence of what happened here, even if no one would believe it. Maybe someone would see these photos and hesitate, just for a moment, before reaching for something glittering in the night air. And maybe, if I documented enough, if I captured every detail of this nightmare with the same obsessive precision that had once made me a decent crime photographer, I'd find a way to break the contract for good. After all, I hadn't just seen the victims disappear. I'd seen them trapped in that void, still conscious, still screaming. Through my viewfinder, I watched the plague doctor begin his hunt anew. My finger pressed the shutter again and again, each click a promise to those faces in the void. History might repeat itself, but this time it wouldn't go unrecorded.
The warehouse air was a suffocating mixture of hot metal, spray paint, and centuries of mold. Even in January, New Orleans humidity crept through the massive sliding doors, making the papier-mâché crack and stick to my fingers as I worked. The sound of it settling in the damp, soft pops and creaks like aging bones, echoed through the cavernous space. My first commission for Krewe of Orpheus should have been a dream come true, but something about Warehouse 13 set my teeth on edge from day one. "You've got good hands, Simone," Baptiste said, materializing behind me like he always did. A metallic taste filled my mouth, like licking a sun-warmed grave marker, and the air grew dense with the scent of his presence. "But your Poseidon looks uncomfortable." He gestured at my half-finished float with paint-stained fingers, flakes of dried color crackling off like dead skin. "And uncomfortable won't do for position 4 in the lineup. Not when the Martels are riding in position 3 with their Atlantis float. The cameras linger there, right before Canal Street. Every tourism board in the city will be watching." Baptiste Laveau had been designing Mardi Gras floats longer than anyone else in the warehouse. His own work, a massive underworld scene commissioned for Position 1, the most prestigious spot in Orpheus, dominated the far corner, its demons already leering with impossible detail. The crew captain had nearly started a civil war by giving him that spot instead of the Doucette family, who'd held it for 3 generations. I forced a smile. Just waiting for the base coat to dry. In truth, I was proud of my Poseidon. The sea god's face captured exactly what I'd envisioned. Power tempered with ancient sadness. But you didn't disagree with Baptiste. Not if you wanted to survive your first carnival season. That night, I dreamed of waves and whispers. When I returned in the morning, Poseidon's expression had changed. The sorrow was gone, replaced by something hungry. The eyes seemed to follow me as I circled the float. My reference sketches showed the original design. I'd spent weeks on them, but this was different. Better, maybe, but not mine. "Magnifique!" Baptiste's voice boomed across the warehouse. "Now that's a god of the sea!" He clapped my shoulder with a hand that felt too cold, even through my paint-splattered coveralls. "You've been holding out on us, Cherie." I started, but stopped. How could I explain that my creation had transformed overnight? That the brushstrokes and the new details were nothing like mine? Over the next week, it happened 2 more times. The serpents I'd sculpted around Poseidon's throne developed scales I hadn't carved, intricate patterns that seemed to shift in the warehouse's fluorescent lighting. The waves gained depth, and sometimes, just at the corner of my eye, they appeared to move. I stayed late one evening, determined to catch whoever was altering my work. The other artists had gone home, leaving that peculiar silence of large, empty spaces. The warehouse's metal walls pinged and groaned as they cooled, and the chemical bite of spray paint hung thick in the air, mixing with the earthier scent of dissolving papier-mâché. Each breath tasted of rust and decay. Even Baptiste, who usually lingered until security kicked him out, had departed early. Armed with coffee and a sketchbook, I settled into the shadows near my float. Around midnight, I noticed something strange about Baptiste's underworld scene. Among his painted demons, I spotted symbols I'd never seen before. Delicate spirals and angular marks that reminded me of the Veuve designs my grandmother used to draw. The sound of humming stopped me cold. It was an old song, something about Baron Samedi and crossroads, coming from inside my float. I crept closer, my phone's flashlight beam shaking across Poseidon's face. The eyes were open wider than I'd left them. A brush clattered to the ground behind me, still wet with paint I hadn't used. When I spun around, I caught a glimpse of someone turning the corner. Too tall to be Baptiste, moving too fluidly to be human. On my float, a new symbol had been painted into Poseidon's crown. My grandmother would have recognized it instantly. A mark of claiming, of ownership, of things that should stay buried in New Orleans soil. I ran all the way to my car. The next morning, Baptiste was waiting by my float, looking as fresh as if he'd slept there. "Your work is improving so quickly," he said, his smile never reaching his eyes. "Tell me, Simone, do you dream of the parade? Of thousands cheering as your art rolls past?" He leaned closer, his cologne smelling of graveyard flowers. "Are you ready to become part of Mardi Gras history?" I didn't like how he emphasized history. My hands shook as I gathered my supplies, mixing them according to the recipes I'd found in Grandmare's box. Holy water, blessed by 3 generations of Delacroix women, went into the paint base. Crushed herbs from Marie's garden, maintained faithfully for a century, were worked into the papier-mâché. I sprinkled graveyard dirt from our family tomb into the gesso, murmuring the words Grandmère taught me between spoonfuls of her gumbo. Protection in layers, Petit. Like a roux, you can't rush the magic. Whatever was happening in Warehouse 13, whatever Baptiste was, I hadn't spent years fighting for this opportunity to run away now. Besides, Grandmère hadn't raised a coward. She'd raised a Delacroix, and we'd been handling New Orleans magic since before Baptiste had claws in this city's soul. I just had to survive until Mardi Gras. The symbols nagged at my memory like a half-forgotten melody. I remembered sitting cross-legged on Grandmère's kitchen floor at age 7, watching her stir blessed water into her gesso mixture. Protection starts with the foundation, Petit, she'd say, painting delicate symbols into the base coat of picture frames, door frames, windowsills. During storm season, she'd lift me up to help paint the marks myself, her wrinkled hands steady over mine, whispering the words that would keep our family safe. But these warehouse symbols were different, darker. I found myself sketching them during lunch breaks, trying to decode their meaning while keeping one eye on Baptiste's increasingly frequent visits to my workspace. Your family's been in New Orleans long? He asked one afternoon, examining my Poseidon's trident with unsettling intensity. The weapon had developed barbs I hadn't sculpted, tips that seemed to gleam wetly under the fluorescent lights. Since before the purchase, I answered carefully, remembering Grandmère's warnings about giving too much information to strangers. Delacroix has been a family name in the quarter for generations. Baptiste's smile widened. Delacroix? Not related to Marie Delacroix by chance? My hands stilled on the float. My great-great-grandmother's name wasn't one I expected to hear from a float artist. Her disappearance during the 1921 carnival season was a family wound that had never quite healed. You know the history, Baptiste continued, his accent thickening like molasses, more genuine now than I'd ever heard it. Every few decades, someone creates a masterpiece for the ages, art that makes Mardi Gras magical. He traced one of the mysterious symbols with his finger, and I swore I saw it pulse. Your great-great-grandmother understood what was at stake. She saw what was happening to the city, to real carnival. He gestured around the warehouse. Look at what they sell as Mardi Gras now. Plastic beads from China, manufactured floats that all look the same, mass-produced masks. The tourists come for their sanitized version of carnival, never knowing what they've lost. The old families forget their traditions, forget the magic that made New Orleans more than just another American city. His voice carried an echo of old grief. I was like you once, watching it all slip away. In 1847, I made a choice to preserve something beautiful. Each artist I take, their talent lives forever in the parade, pure, unchanging, not corrupted by commerce or diluted by time. That night, I dreamed of Marie. She stood before an ancient float, her hands moving across it like a pianist at keys. But unlike the stories of her disappearance, I saw what really happened. She wasn't Baptiste's victim. She was laying a trap, working protection spells into every brushstroke, every carved detail. The designs beneath her fingers writhed and transformed, becoming something glorious and terrible. Each symbol she painted was a chain, each color a binding. Behind her, a tall figure watched, its shadow stretching impossibly across the warehouse floor, not yet realizing it was being caged by her art. When she turned, her eyes held not hunger but fierce determination, the same look Grandmère wore when teaching me our family's crafts. I woke gasping, my bedsheets damp with sweat despite the January chill. On my nightstand sat Grandmère's old recipe box, the one she'd insisted I take when I got the warehouse job. I'd assumed it held her famous king cake recipe, but now I understood the real inheritance inside. Generations of protection spells disguised as baking instructions, paint formulas masked as cocktail recipes. The next day, I called in sick and headed to the historic New Orleans collection. The archivist raised an eyebrow when I requested photos from the 1921 carnival season, but didn't comment. She did. However, pull me aside when she saw me studying the Krewe membership rolls. "You're the new Orpheus artist, aren't you?" She glanced around before continuing. "You should know. The Krews weren't always just about parades and balls. The old families, they divided up the city like a cake. Uptown parades for the Protestants, Mid-City for the Catholics. Canal Street was the divide. Even now, certain families control certain aspects. The Duprees handle liquor licenses for the balls. The Chenots manage parade permits. The Boudreaux coordinate with the police. And some families..." She touched a photograph from 1921, her finger resting near Baptiste's figure. "Some families handle the parts of Carnival that don't make it into the tourist brochures." For hours, I pored over yellowed photographs and parade programs, seeing the patterns now. The same names repeated in different combinations, like a dance that had been going on for centuries. The same floats appearing in different parades, subtly changed. And there, in the background of so many photos, Baptiste. A group photo of the Artists Guild, dated 1921. Marie stood in the front row, her face glowing with triumph. And there, in the back, barely visible but unmistakable, was Baptiste. Not a day younger than he appeared now. But another photo caught my eye. Baptiste alone, dated 1847. He stood before a carnival wagon, paintbrush in hand, wearing the intense expression of an artist lost in his work. The inscription read, "Jean-Baptiste Lavaux, master painter of the French Quarter. Lost to fever, 1847. The same face, the same eyes, but different somehow. Alive with passion rather than hunger." My hands trembled as I flipped through more photographs. Baptiste appeared again and again, decades apart, always in the background, always watching. 1898, 1945, 1967, 1989. Different names in the captions, but the same knowing smile. One photo made me pause. The Rex Parade of 1907, right before the infamous float collapse that killed 2 spectators. The newspaper blamed rotted wood, but in the photo, taken moments before the accident, Baptiste stood near the float's base, his hand resting on wood that seemed to darken beneath his touch. 1923, Baptiste in the crowd at the Krewe of Momus parade, the night their most elaborate float inexplicably caught fire, the flames reportedly burning carnival-colored purple and green. 1928, the year half the Rex Parade's floats were found mysteriously transformed overnight, their original designs replaced by darker themes that newspapers called unsuitable for children. Each time, Baptiste lingered in the background, watching. But the most disturbing was from 1979, the infamous Ghost Parade incident, when dozens of spectators reported seeing an unauthorized parade rolling down Canal Street at midnight, filled with floats no one had built, and riders no one could identify. The one clear photo from that night showed Baptiste atop a float that seemed to be made of shifting shadows. Each era showed the city changing around him, old buildings falling, new ones rising, tourists replacing locals, plastic beads replacing glass. In each photo, the carnival pieces grew more commercial, more manufactured, less magical, until you reached the floats he'd touched. Those still held the old magic, the kind that made children gasp and adults remember what wonder felt like, the kind that was dying everywhere else in the city. When I returned to the warehouse, 3 more artists had quit. Their unfinished floats sat abandoned, except they weren't unfinished anymore. Each one had been completed with a mastery that made my skin crawl. Outside the warehouse gates, I'd seen their families posting flyers, making calls, filing missing persons reports that would join the others in the city's cold case files. All artists who had vanished during carnival season, leaving behind only their masterpieces. Baptiste's work area had expanded, his underworld scene now incorporating elements that seemed to move when viewed from the corner of my eye. But it wasn't just the warehouse that felt wrong anymore. The whole city seemed muted, as if Baptiste's influence was spreading through every parade route, every celebration. Children didn't laugh as loudly at the bead throws. The music from street corners sounded hollow. Even the usually vibrant carnival colors looked washed out, like joy itself was being drained away, parade by parade, float by float, artist by artist. "Welcome back, Cherie," Baptiste called from across the warehouse. "You missed quite a productive day." He was working on a mask, not one for the floats, but an old-style carnival mask that seemed to be made of material I couldn't quite identify. "You know, there's still time to make this year's parade truly memorable." He held up the mask, and for a moment, I thought I saw something shift behind its eye holes. "Your grandmother's teachings might serve you well here." I thought of Marie, of the other artists whose names had faded from carnival history, and of the dark bargains New Orleans folklore warned about. The parade was less than 2 weeks away. Whatever Baptiste was offering, whatever he truly was, I knew I had to find a way to stop him before another Delacroix became just another disappeared artist in the warehouse records. That night, as I left, I noticed new symbols appearing on my float, bleeding up through the paint like dark water rising. But these weren't Baptiste's marks. They were older, more familiar, protection symbols I remembered from Grandma's teachings. Somewhere in the warehouse shadows, I heard Baptiste laugh. The real game was just beginning. The week before, Mardi Gras buzzed with a feverish energy that had nothing to do with the approaching parades. I'd spent my nights researching, dividing time between my grandmother's old journals and visits to a Mambo priestess in the 9th Ward who'd known my family for generations. She explained what the tourist guides didn't, how the river families kept the water spirits happy, how the Garden District crews paid tribute to older powers in their private balls, how the Creole families maintained the delicate balance between the seen and unseen sides of Carnival. During days, I watched Baptiste watching me, both of us circling each other like wary cats. The parade order had been reshuffled 3 times already. Unheard of this close to Fat Tuesday. The crew captain claimed it was about television coverage, but I knew better. Baptiste was positioning his pawns, placing the doomed artists' floats at critical points along the route where the city's power lines crossed. The other artists had dwindled to a handful, all of them moving through the warehouse with distant eyes and paint-stained hands. Their floats were masterpieces, too perfect, too alive. "You've been busy, Simone," Baptiste said 3 days before Fat Tuesday. He stood before my Poseidon, which now rippled with endless layers of detail, each wave seemingly caught mid-crash. "But you still haven't accepted my offer. Time's running short." "Like it ran short for Marie?" I kept my voice steady. "Or the others?" His laugh echoed strangely. "They became part of something greater. Their art lives forever in carnival memory." He gestured at his massive underworld float, where faces seemed to peer from every shadow. "We could create such wonders together." "We're already creating wonders," I said, fingering the gris-gris bag hidden in my pocket. "Why isn't that enough?" "Enough?" His face shifted, paint running like wax as centuries of stolen features swirled beneath his skin. "Mardi Gras isn't about enough. It's about excess, about transformation. The line between spectator and spectacle, living and dead, art and artist, all blur during Carnival." He extended his hand, paint dripping from his fingers like dark water. "Join the parade, Simone. Really join it. Like the others did. Like they all do, every year, feeding their creativity, their vitality, their joy into the Carnival machine. Why do you think New Orleans needs bigger and brighter parades each year? The city is running dry, Cherie. The real magic is fading, but we keep it alive, even if we have to feed it ourselves." I backed away. "Like you joined it? How long ago was that, Baptiste? Before the purchase? Before New Orleans?" Smart girl. Marie asked questions too. She understood what we were fighting for. Paint ran down his face like wax as he spoke, but beneath it, I caught glimpses of the man from that old photograph. The artist who'd loved this city enough to become a monster for it. Remember the Cotton Centennial of 1884? When the parade floats were so beautiful they made people weep? That was real magic. Or 1857, when 3 kings arrived simultaneously at Jackson Square, each claiming to be the true Rex. The city nearly tore itself apart trying to decide which parade to follow. His voice carried an echo of old grief. Then came the sanitized version, The licensed throws, the regulated routes, the permitted celebrations. Even the 1917 ban on masks during World War I, as if covering our faces wasn't older than the city itself. Each rule, each regulation, each improvement stealing something vital from Carnival's soul. Paint dripped from his fingers like dark water, but it wasn't just paint. It was history, memory, magic concentrated into pure form. The price of immortality is participation, not just your talent, but your love for this city, your understanding of what Carnival really means. Join us in the eternal parade, where the real New Orleans still lives, where every throw is blown glass, every mask is handmade, every moment is pure joy untouched by time, where art still has power and magic still matters. He gestured at his float, and I finally saw the faces clearly. Generations of artists, their features melted and remade in eternal celebration. But they weren't tortured or trapped. They were dancing, creating, celebrating a carnival that never ended, never changed, never lost its soul to commerce and compromise. We dance forever in the carnival dark, keeping the real magic alive until the city remembers what it's forgotten. That night, I waited until the security guard made his final round. Through the warehouse windows, I could see the carnival moon rising, bloated and yellow as old varnish. In less than 24 hours, at the stroke of midnight on Fat Tuesday, Baptiste's harvest would begin. The protection symbols I'd been secretly painting formed a circle around my workspace. Each color pulsed with remembered voices, generations of artists who'd fought this battle before me. From the underworld float, I heard whispers in French, Spanish, Creole, English. Not the tortured sounds I'd expected, but a symphony of creation. The trapped artists were still artists, after all, and tonight was their chance to make something new. A clock somewhere in the city struck 11. 1 hour until Fat Tuesday officially began. 1 hour to break a cycle that had been devouring New Orleans artists for over a century. Above me, the warehouse's ancient fans creaked like carnival wheels, stirring the heavy air thick with paint fumes and possibilities. He emerged from the shadows as I knew he would, wearing that mask I couldn't quite look at directly. Last chance, Cherie. Mardi Gras comes tomorrow. You're right, I said, stepping into my circle. It does. I began to sing. An old song, older than New Orleans, older than Baptiste's carnival magic. My grandmother had taught it to me in fragments, never telling me why I needed to know it. Now I understood. The Delacroix women had been preparing for this confrontation for generations. The trapped artists joined in, their voices rising from every float in the warehouse. A century of carnival songs merged and transformed, jazz funeral dirges, Creole ballads, Cajun two-steps, bounce beats, even the tourist-friendly versions of When the Saints Go Marching In. The music swirled together, old and new, traditional and modern, until the air itself seemed to vibrate with the story of New Orleans. Baptiste's form flickered like a bad projection, but his face showed something I hadn't expected. Recognition. You can't banish me, child. I am Carnival. No, I said, my voice growing stronger as other voices harmonized with mine. You're what Carnival was, but it's always changing, always moving, like the city itself. The voices of children who'd never known old Carnival joined with those who'd built it, creating something entirely new. We don't need you to preserve it anymore. The warehouse air grew thick with power. Beyond Baptiste, the faces in his float began to strain forward, no longer content to be preserved in his amber of memory. They weren't just reaching, they were creating. Paint swirled off his floats in rivers of color, forming new patterns in the air. A jazz trumpeter from 1898 wove gold notes into my protection circle. A Creole mask maker from 1923 carved symbols of freedom into the warehouse beams. A graffiti artist from 1985 tagged the air with glowing sigils of change. My Poseidon's eyes blazed with an inner light, but not with hunger now, with possibility. Baptiste had been right about one thing. Carnival was magic. But real magic wasn't about preservation. It was about transformation. Baptiste lunged, his form stretching grotesquely, but he couldn't cross our circle. Not my circle alone anymore, but one created by every artist who'd ever loved this city enough to help it grow. My song reached crescendo, generations of voices joining mine. Marie's ribbon glowed, and I understood. She hadn't been taken or trapped. She'd been gathering power all these years, building a bridge between what Carnival was and what it could become. The warehouse erupted in light and sound, a second line for the ages, a jazz funeral for things that needed to die, a birth announcement for something new. When my vision cleared, Baptiste was gone. His float had transformed into something different, still magnificent, but no longer frozen in time. The trapped faces had vanished, released at last into whatever carnival they chose to create. My Poseidon remained powerful, but had softened, bearing touches of every era. Gilt from the 1890s, Art Deco flourishes from the 20s, psychedelic swirls from the 60s, hip-hop energy from the 90s. The protection symbols had embedded themselves permanently into the base, invisible to most eyes, but there for those who knew to look. I worked through the night, adding final touches. As dawn broke on Mardi Gras morning, I stepped back to admire the float that was finally, truly ours. Not just mine, but touched by every artist who'd loved this city enough to let it change. It wasn't the kind of masterpiece Baptiste had offered, frozen in eternal perfection. It was messy and alive and real, like New Orleans itself. The parade rolled that evening, and if some spectators claimed they saw extra figures dancing around my float, well, that's just carnival magic. The real kind. The kind that brings joy instead of hunger, that celebrates life instead of preserving it in amber. Some said they heard old songs mixing with new ones, traditional instruments harmonizing with synthesizers and drum machines. Others swore they saw ancient artists painting alongside young taggers, their work merging into something that honored the past while embracing the future. I still work in Warehouse 13. Someone needs to keep watch, to remember the old stories while helping write new ones. Besides, I'm a Delacroix. New Orleans Carnival runs in my blood. But every year, before the painting begins, I refresh the protection symbols, just in case. And sometimes, late at night, I hear them. The artists Baptiste collected, now free to create new works, new traditions, new magic. They're still part of Carnival, but on their own terms now. Still dancing, still celebrating, still transforming, like the city itself. After all, there's always another Mardi Gras coming, and each one is both ancient and brand new, exactly as it should be.
The invitation arrived on thick parchment that smelled of grave dirt and honey. I should have known then, should have recognized the weight of old magic in the way the black ink seemed to shift under the gaslight. But I was young, eager, and desperate to belong to something greater than myself. The funeral homes and dive bars of the French Quarter had begun to feel like a cage. Each day another reminder that I was the last Bennett still haunting these streets. My parents had fled New Orleans years ago, leaving me to shoulder the weight of our family's fading legacy alone. The old money families that had once welcomed my great-grandmother to their soirees now barely acknowledged my existence. I'd taken to spending my nights sketching their crumbling mansions from the shadows, trying to capture some echo of the grandeur my family had once been part of. Sometimes I'd dream of her, Elizabeth Bennett, the family legend who'd vanished 50 years ago after a Mardi Gras ball. In the dreams, she was always trying to tell me something, her words drowned out by the sound of carnival music and breaking glass. The only photo I had of her showed her standing in front of the Beauchamp house, one hand raised to her throat, where a strange crimson brooch caught the light. She'd written something on the back in shaking script. The masks we wear become the faces we show. Below that, barely legible, she'd added, "Remember the counterstep." I'd found the photo hidden in my grandfather's dance instruction book, tucked between pages of peculiar waltzes that never quite resolved their rhythms. My grandfather used to sit me on his knee and trace the strange circular scars on his palms, telling me they were from the night his mother disappeared. "Some prices are worth paying," he'd say, though he never explained what he meant. He'd taught me to waltz in our decaying garden, insisting on peculiar steps that seemed to follow no natural rhythm. Now, as I broke the invitation's seal, my hands trembled with more than just excitement. Here it was, written in flowing script that caught the light like fresh ink, though the paper felt centuries old, an invitation to the reopening of the Beauchamp house, extended exclusively to the Bennett heir. I ran my fingers over the embossed letters, remembering all the times I'd been turned away from the Garden District's iron gates, all the whispered conversations that stopped when I entered a room. My last name might have been mud in New Orleans society, but someone still remembered us. Someone still thought we belonged. I pressed the invitation to my nose, breathing in that strange perfume of decay and sweetness, and felt tears prick at my corners of my eyes. Finally, I thought, a chance to reclaim what we'd lost. Finally, a way to prove that the Bennetts weren't finished in this city. The gates of the Beauchamp house creaked open as my taxicab approached, though no guard stood watch. Spanish moss draped the iron spikes like funeral shrouds, and beneath the rising moon, the entire property rippled with an otherworldly glow. The scent of magnolias hung thick in the air, though it wasn't the season for them. It was the same impossible smell that had clung to my grandfather's clothes the night he died, still mumbling about masks and music and his mother's unfinished dance. I paid the driver, who sped away the moment my feet touched the gravel drive. Each step crunched with unnatural loudness, and I could have sworn I saw faces in the twisted bark of the ancient oaks. Faces that seemed almost familiar, like the ones in our old family photographs that my grandfather had burned before his death. "Welcome, Mr. Bennett." A figure emerged from behind a marble angel, wearing a mask that seemed to be made of burnished gold and black feathers. The mask moved when he spoke, as if it were his real face. "We've waited generations for you to join us." Other guests glided up the path ahead of me, their elaborate masks catching moonlight and throwing strange shadows. None of them seemed to walk so much as float, their feet barely disturbing the gravel. The mansion loomed above us, its windows blazing with gaslight that somehow failed to warm the cold, dead facade. The main hall stretched upward into darkness, crystal chandeliers throwing fractured light across faded wallpaper and oil paintings of masked figures. The air tasted stale, like it hadn't moved in 50 years. James Bennett. The crew leader stepped forward, his mask a twisted thing of silver and bone that made my eyes hurt to look at it directly. He held out a mask of deep crimson, traced with gold filigree in patterns that seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at them. "Your birthright awaits." My fingers trembled as I took it. The mask felt warm, alive somehow, like holding someone's face in my hands. The crimson surface rippled at my touch, the gold filigree writhing beneath the surface like veins pulsing with molten metal. I raised it to my face, and the moment it touched my skin, fire erupted across my nerve endings. Not the sharp, clean burn of a flame, but the deep, wet heat of infection. The mask seemed to soften, its edges becoming liquid, searching. I felt it probe the pores of my skin, thousands of microscopic tendrils testing, tasting, seeking purchase in my flesh. A high, thin whine filled my ears, like crystal about to shatter, rising in pitch until it seemed to vibrate in my teeth. I tried to scream, but the sound died in my throat as the mask began to meld with my face. I could feel it sinking into me, layer by layer, each new depth accompanied by a sound like wet silk tearing in slow motion. First the epidermis, then deeper, threading itself through the fat and muscle beneath. My fingernails scraped uselessly against its surface as I clawed at it, only to feel the sensation in both my fingers and what had once been the mask's outer layer, as if I were scratching my own skin. The noise of its integration was deafening from inside my head, 1,000 whispers layered over the wet click of tendons reorganizing, the subtle crack of blood vessels being rerouted. The pain evolved, became more intimate. Like teeth growing in reverse, I felt the mask anchoring itself to my facial bones, spinning webs of alien tissue through my sinuses, behind my eyes. Each new connection sent resonant tones through my skull, a discordant symphony of frequencies that shouldn't exist together. The gold filigree burned like traceries of lightning beneath my flesh, a nervous system parallel to but distinct from my own, its creation accompanied by a sound like strumming metal filaments. My stomach heaved as I felt the foreign consciousness seeping into the hollows of my skull, tasting my memories, my fears, its presence marked by a subsonic hum that made my bones vibrate. I stumbled, fingers still scrabbling at the place where mask met flesh, but there was no seam, no edge, just a seamless transition that undulated beneath my trembling hands. The initial agony subsided into a deep, pulsing ache that resonated through my teeth and eye sockets, keeping time with a heartbeat that didn't feel entirely like my own. Perfect fit. The leader's mask stretched into what might have been a smile, the bone plates grinding against each other with a sound like porcelain teeth. Just like your great-grandmother's was. I staggered to one of the spotted mirrors lining the hall. My reflection showed the mask had become something more than mere costume. The edges blended seamlessly into my skin, and as I watched in horror, the gold filigree patterns shifted like living things beneath the surface. The night is young. Hands gripped my shoulders, steering me toward the ballroom. And the dance must begin. We have so much to show you, James. So many family traditions to uphold. The ballroom doors swung open, revealing a space that seemed to extend far beyond what the mansion's exterior should have allowed. The air changed immediately, not just stale, but thick with the greasy sweetness of tallow candles, and something deeper, more metallic. It coated the back of my throat like cold bacon fat. Dozens of masked figures turned to face me in perfect unison, and in that moment, I knew I'd made a terrible mistake. But like the mask now fused to my face, there was no going back. The dance was about to begin. Music drifted from unseen corners of the ballroom, a waltz that sounded like weeping strings and distant screams. The crystalline notes seemed to bypass my ears entirely, vibrating directly against my bones. Static electricity crackled in the air, raising gooseflesh on my arms and making the fine hairs on my neck dance. The temperature dropped in waves, patches of Arctic cold drifting through the room like invisible currents, carrying with them the mineral smell of ancient stone and wet copper. The masked figures began to move in perfect synchronization, their feet barely touching the warped hardwood floor, which creaked and sighed beneath them like something dying. A woman in a peacock mask clutched my arm, her fingers digging in with impossible strength. "Dance," she whispered, her voice like rustling autumn leaves. The mask's beak clicked against my cheek as she pulled me close. Everyone must dance. We joined the swirling crowd, and I felt my feet moving of their own accord, following steps I'd never learned. The woman's eyes behind her mask were solid black, like pools of oil. "Your great-grandmother danced here too." Her words came in time with the haunting melody. "She wore the same mask you're wearing now. Can you feel her memories seeping through?" And I could. Flashes of another Mardi Gras night 50 years ago began bleeding into my consciousness. I saw this same ballroom through different eyes, felt the same creeping horror as the mask slowly became one with my ancestors' flesh. Time to change partners. The peacock mask released me, and I was spun into the arms of a tall man wearing what appeared to be a deer skull fashioned from silver. "The masks are hungry tonight." His voice resonated from somewhere deep within the skull. "They always are when they sense familiar blood." His grip tightened as I tried to pull away. "Do you know why this mansion hasn't hosted an event in 50 years, James?" I shook my head, fighting the urge to scream as I noticed the other dancers. With each turn around the floor, their masks were consuming them, devouring their humanity one layer at a time. A woman in a hummingbird mask spun past, and I watched in horror as the metallic beak lengthened, puncturing through her cheek from the inside, blood slick and gleaming. The sound was like a needle through silk, followed by the soft patter of blood on hardwood. The delicate filigree wings had burrowed under her skin like parasitic veins, spreading a web of tarnished silver down her neck and beneath her collar, each new branch accompanied by a sound like fine chains being pulled through flesh. Beside her, a man's fox mask had begun reorganizing the bones beneath it. I heard the wet cracking sounds as his jaw elongated, pushing out through the mask's muzzle, not the clean snap of broken bone, but the organic, deliberate sound of skeletal structures choosing to change. His eyes, visible through the eye holes, were changing too, pupils elongating, irises bleeding into new colors as the mask reshaped the very structure of his sockets. The transformation produced notes like wet fingers on crystal, a resonance that seemed to vibrate in sympathy with something inhuman. When he opened his mouth to gasp in pain, I saw his teeth were falling out, each one hitting the floor with a sound like breaking chalk, replaced by sharp vulpine points that grew directly from the mask's interior with a noise like icicles forming in reverse. A butterfly mask across the room had become a living thing, its wings pulsing against the wearer's temples with obscene intimacy. Each beat sent visible waves through the woman's skin, producing a sound like wet velvet being rhythmically stretched. I could see dark shapes moving beneath the surface, proboscis-like tendrils worming their way toward her brain, their progress marked by tiny popping sounds as they breached new layers of tissue. Her eyes had already transformed into compound structures, reflecting the gaslight in dozens of faceted surfaces, the transformation accompanied by sounds like breaking sugar glass. The last ball ended, messily. The deer skull clicked its teeth together. But tonight will be different. Tonight we complete what was started in 1973. Your bloodline is the key. The music shifted, becoming faster, more discordant. Dancers spun past me in a blur of color and movement. I caught glimpses of masks merging with flesh, of eyes changing color, of fingers elongating into impossible shapes. Look! The deer skull forced me to turn toward one corner of the ballroom. A couple I'd seen earlier had vanished, leaving only their clothing in a heap on the floor. As I watched, another dancer simply faded from existence mid-step, their partner continuing on alone as if nothing had happened. The mask on my face grew warmer, and I felt something trying to push its way into my mind. Memories, knowledge, secrets that no living person was meant to know. I needed to get out, needed to find answers before I disappeared like the others. But the dance continued, and my feet kept moving. And somewhere in the mansion, something ancient and hungry was beginning to wake up. Through the haze of forced dancing and invasive memories, I spotted a gap in the whirling figures. The library doors stood ajar, promising escape from this macabre waltz. I waited until my next partner change, then stumbled through the opening, the music's pull weakening with each step I took into the book-lined sanctuary. The library smelled of mildew and copper, its shelves reaching up into darkness. Gas lamps cast sickly shadows across leather-bound volumes with titles in languages I'd never seen. My mask throbbed in time with my racing pulse, and in the warped reflection of a glass case, I saw the gold filigree had begun to spread past its edges, creating delicate patterns across my cheeks. "You shouldn't be in here." A woman in a crumbling porcelain mask stood by a massive desk, her gloved fingers tracing the spine of an ancient ledger. "But since you are, you might as well learn why you were chosen." She opened the book, and I recognized the dark brown ink for what it really was. Blood, long dried but somehow still glistening. Names filled the pages, hundreds of them, and beside each one was a small sketch of a mask. These are the chosen ones. Her porcelain mask had hairline cracks spreading across its surface, revealing glimpses of something dark moving underneath. "Your great-grandmother's name is here, see?" Her finger stopped on a familiar mask design, the same one currently burning into my face. I leaned closer, the words swimming into focus. Elizabeth Bennet, 1973. Status: incomplete. What does that mean? The question came out as a whisper. The woman's mask split further, revealing a smile made of shadows. It means she escaped before the transformation was complete. She broke the circle, ruined the ritual. Pages fluttered as she turned to the back of the book. "But now we have you, her blood, wearing her mask. The circle can be completed." A bell tolled somewhere in the mansion, its deep resonance shaking dust from the shelves. The woman's head snapped up. Midnight approaches. The real dance is about to begin. The library doors burst open, releasing a flood of discordant music. My feet began moving against my will, pulling me back toward the ballroom. But now I knew, this wasn't just a masked ball. It was a gathering of predators, and I was meant to be more than just prey. I was meant to be a replacement. Back in the ballroom, the scene had transformed. The gas lamps now burned with a sickly green flame that left persistent afterimages swimming in my vision. The air had become soup thick with the stench of hot metal and ozone, like lightning about to strike. Each breath felt like inhaling molten glass, and the oxygen itself seemed to vibrate at a frequency that made my teeth ache. The dancers moved with inhuman grace, their masks fully fused to distorted faces, leaving contrails of phosphorescent light in the increasingly dense air. The temperature cycled wildly, one moment so cold that frost crystallized on the windows, the next hot enough to make the wood panels sweat centuries-old sap that reeked of frankincense and decay. The music hammered against my skull, each note driving the crimson mask deeper into my flesh, while the very walls seemed to pulse with a wet, organic rhythm. The crew leader appeared on a balcony that hadn't existed moments before, his silver bone mask now adorned with writhing tendrils. He didn't speak so much as resonate, his voice bypassing my ears to vibrate directly in my skull. The circle remembers its broken pieces. Dancers formed concentric rings, and I found myself pulled into the pattern. The woman in the porcelain mask appeared beside me, gripping my wrist. Your great-grandmother's defiance cursed us all. For 50 years we've waited, incomplete, unable to finish our transformation. What transformation? I tried to pull away, but my body moved mechanically, following the intricate steps of a dance I somehow knew but had never learned. Her mask had split entirely now, revealing a face that was no longer human. We are the crew of lost souls for a reason, James. These masks, they're not costumes, they're gateways. As if to demonstrate, another dancer simply ceased. Their mask remained suspended in air for a moment before collapsing to the floor, empty. Around the circle, more disappeared, leaving behind only their masks and clothing. My mind raced through the fragments of inherited memory seeping through my mask. The ledger, the names, the ritual. This wasn't about power or tradition. It was about replacement. The crew needed fresh souls to take their places so they could finally complete their transformation into something else. I spotted a door leading to what looked like the wine cellar, partially hidden behind a moldering curtain. If I could break free from the dance, if I could find something in the mansion's depths. Don't fight it. The leader's voice slithered through my thoughts. Embrace your heritage. Your great-grandmother's resistance only delayed the inevitable. But as the dance spiraled toward its climax, and more guests vanished around me, I remembered something from the ledger. Elizabeth Bennet. Status: incomplete. She had escaped. She had found a way out. The mask burned hotter, trying to force submission, but in that pain came clarity. I wasn't just wearing her mask. I had inherited her strength, her defiance. And so, me wearing this mansion was the secret of how she had broken free. With tremendous effort, I wrenched myself from the dance pattern. The porcelain-masked woman screamed, the sound like breaking glass. I lurched toward the cellar door, my muscles fighting every step. Behind me, the music rose to a fevered pitch, and the remaining dancers began to change, their forms twisting into impossible shapes. I reached the door as the first wave of otherworldly energy pulsed through the ballroom. The cellar steps beckoned, descending into darkness, promising either escape or damnation. Above, the crew leader's laugh echoed like thunder. "Run, little Bennett," he called. "Run deep into our home. There's nowhere here your blood hasn't already been." The cellar steps creaked beneath my feet as I descended, each one bearing the weight of decades of secrets. The air grew thick with the scent of earth and old wine, but beneath that lay something else, the metallic tang of blood and the musty odor of decay. My mask pulsed with each heartbeat, and I felt the gold filigree extending its domain. It pushed past my jawline like molten threads being drawn through my flesh by unseen needles. Each new branching pattern burned as it etched itself into my skin, leaving trails of sensation that felt like ice-cold worms burrowing ever deeper. The metallic tendrils probed down my neck, wrapping around my throat in an intimate noose. I could feel them testing the boundaries of my arteries, seeking entry into my bloodstream. Where the filigree spread, my skin began to change texture, hardening into something that felt more like lacquered porcelain than flesh. The transformation crept down my throat, making each swallow feel like grinding glass. Through this burning connection, Foreign memories began seeping into my consciousness. My great-grandmother's desperate flight down these same stairs, the knowledge of what waited below, and the terrible price of freedom. But now I could feel the full horror of her experience, the way the mask had tried to hollow her out from the inside, to make space for something else to move in. Gas lamps sputtered to life as I reached the cellar floor, revealing rows of wine racks that stretched into shadow. But the bottles weren't filled with wine. Each one contained something that moved, something that pressed against the dark glass with desperate intensity. I stepped closer, drawn by a horrible fascination. The nearest bottle held what looked like smoke at first, but as my eyes adjusted, I saw it was more like liquid mother of pearl, swirling and coalescing into almost recognizable shapes. A face pressed against the glass from inside, features distorted as if viewed through thick honey, mouth open in a silent scream. Then it dissolved back into writhing patterns, only to reform as something worse. Hands clawing at the bottle's walls, eyes blinking open and shut in impossible places, fragments of expressions I recognized from the portraits upstairs. "They're souls," said a figure emerging from behind the racks. Another guest, wearing a mask of bronze leaves that had begun to sprout real vines. Previous attempts, failed transformations. The vines from his mask wrapped around his throat as he spoke. "Your great-grandmothers would have been here too if she hadn't found the passage." I moved down the row, unable to look away. Some bottles contained multiple souls, tangled together like fighting fish, their forms bleeding into one another before tearing apart again. Others held single entities that had been trapped so long they barely maintained human shape. Just vague suggestions of limbs and faces, like watching clouds form and dissolve. The glass was warm to the touch, vibrating with a faint hum that made my teeth ache. One bottle near the end contained something more coherent, a woman's face that maintained its shape long enough for me to see her lips moving. She pressed her palm against the glass, and I instinctively raised my hand to mirror hers. The moment our hands aligned, separated by the bottle's wall, a voice whispered directly into my mind. "The mask's hunger, always hunger. Don't let—" Her features collapsed into ribbons of pearlescent light before she could finish. The bottles seemed to pulse in sequence, like a heartbeat echoing through the cellar. Where the gas lamp's light struck the glass, it refracted through the trapped souls in ways that hurt my eyes. Colors that shouldn't exist, patterns that suggested geometries that couldn't survive in our reality. Some of the older bottles had grown cloudy with age, and through their murky surfaces, I could see souls that had begun to crystallize, forming delicate lattices that chimed faintly when the bottles vibrated. Above us, the mansion trembled with otherworldly power. Dust and aged mortar rained down as the ritual reached a fever pitch. I could feel the pull of the dance even here, trying to draw me back upstairs. The souls in their bottles responded to the music too, swirling faster, their shapes becoming more frantic, more desperate. One bottle near my head began to keen, a high crystalline note that set the others resonating in sympathy. "The passage," I gasped, fighting against the compulsion. "Where is it?" Bronze Leaves tilted his head, vines creeping across his shoulders. "Behind the last rack, but you'll never reach it. The masks don't let go easily." As if to demonstrate, he began walking backward, pulled by invisible strings. "The dance calls. We must all dance." I watched him disappear up the stairs, then turned to the far wall. The last wine rack was different from the others, the wood darker, older, marked with symbols that hurt my eyes to look at directly. As I approached, my mask grew hotter, trying to force me to turn back. But with each step, I felt something else too, a counterweight to the mask's power. The memories it had forced upon me contained its own weakness. My great-grandmother hadn't just escaped, she had discovered something, a truth written in the very foundations of this place. The rack swung away with a groan, revealing a narrow passage beyond. Words were carved into the arch above it, the letters formed from what looked like fossilized masks. Through flesh and memory, blood pays the toll, to break the mask that claims the soul. The passage beckoned, promising answers or oblivion. Behind me, the music from above changed tone, becoming something hungry and primitive. They would be coming for me soon. I took a deep breath and stepped through the arch, into darkness that felt older than time itself. The truth waited somewhere ahead. I just had to survive long enough to find it. The passage twisted downward, the walls pressing in close enough to scrape my shoulders. My mask's heat became almost unbearable, and in the darkness I could see the gold filigree patterns glowing, casting weird shadows that seemed to move independently of my motion. The chamber's air felt ancient and thick, like breathing through centuries of accumulated cobwebs. Something dripped in the darkness ahead, not water. The sound was too viscous, too rhythmic, each drop hitting stone with a sound like a smothered heartbeat. As I rounded a bend, I entered a circular chamber that stole the breath from my lungs. The smell hit me first, old incense and older blood, magnolia blossoms rotting in summer heat, and beneath it all, the cloying sweetness of honeysuckle growing over graves. Hundreds of masks hung suspended from the ceiling, each one still containing the preserved face of its last wearer. Their eyes followed my movement, and I swore I could hear them whispering, a sound like dead leaves skating across marble. The air grew thicker with each step, becoming almost gelatinous, resistant to movement. It carried strange currents of heat and cold, and tasted of verdigris and dried roses on my tongue. The walls were covered in writing, the same blood ink from the ledger upstairs forming elaborate scrolling text that spiraled from floor to ceiling. At the chamber's center stood a pedestal, and on it lay a single mask, colorless, transparent, like it was carved from living water. Beautiful, isn't it? The crew leader's voice echoed from every direction. He stepped from behind the pedestal, his silver-bone mask now fully alive, writhing with tentacles that caressed the air. The first mask, the one that taught us how to transcend. I tried to back away, but other figures emerged from the shadows, the remaining dancers, their masks now fused completely with twisted, inhuman forms. They formed a circle around me, swaying to music I could still feel in my bones. Your great-grandmother stood here too. The leader's tentacles traced the air in geometric patterns that hurt my eyes. Such a waste. She forced us to wait, to preserve fragments of ourselves in glass. His mask tilted at an impossible angle. But blood remembers. Blood returns. My eyes darted across the wall text, searching for anything that might help. The mask burned hotter, trying to distract me, to pull my attention back to the dance that was beginning around me. But there, behind the leader, words written in a different hand, scored deep into the stone. The mask feeds on fear and isolation. United blood breaks the bond. Understanding crashed through me like lightning. My great-grandmother hadn't escaped alone. The ledger had shown other incomplete transformations from that night. Other families, other bloodlines. I looked closer at the dancers surrounding me. Through their twisted masks, I could see familiar features, the same ones I'd noticed in old family photographs. They weren't just random guests. They were descendants, like me, and together. The leader must have seen the realization in my eyes. He lunged forward, bone tentacles reaching for my throat. But for the first time that night, I didn't try to run. Instead, I began to dance. But not their dance, a different one. The steps coming from memories that weren't tainted by the mask's influence. My great-grandmother had known this would happen, had prepared for it across generations. The knowledge had been passed down in mundane things, the way my mother taught me to waltz, the strange circular patterns my grandfather drew in the garden. "Stop him!" The leader's voice cracked with desperation. "The circle must be maintained." I grabbed the hand of the woman in the peacock mask. "Your grandmother," I gasped through the burning pain. "She was Angela Roberts. She escaped with mine." Recognition flared in her oil-black eyes. The mask's grip on her seemed to falter. I spun her in a counterclockwise turn, opposite to the crew's ritual dance. "Thomas Wright," I called to the man in the deer skull. "Your grandfather played jazz at the Maple Leaf every Thursday. He made it out that night, too." One by one, I called to the descendants, using fragments of memories that weren't clouded by mask magic. Real memories, passed down through whispered warnings and family stories. With each name, each connection, our dance grew stronger. We moved together, a counter-ritual 50 years in the making. The leader made a sound like breaking glass played backwards, and the wine bottles in the cellar above began to shatter in sequence, a cascade of destruction that followed some alien rhythm. His mask seemed to fold in on itself, revealing geometries that shouldn't exist in three-dimensional space. "Blood is exactly what's breaking it," I said, as our circle of dancers moved faster, our steps matching the heartbeat rhythm of genuine human connection rather than the hollow percussion of the crew's music. The masks began to crack, first mine, then the others. Gold filigree retreated like frost under sunlight. The leader lunged for us, bone tentacles whipping through the air, but he couldn't penetrate the circle of our dance. "My great-grandmother didn't just escape," I said, my voice growing stronger as the mask's power weakened. "She left us a way to end this, all of us, together." The hanging masks began to fall, shattering on the stone floor. The leader's form twisted, tentacles thrashing wildly as his power over us dissolved. Our masks crumbled piece by piece, revealing faces marked by the ordeal but ultimately, undeniably human. But as my mask fell away in crimson shards, I felt one piece remain, fusing permanently with the skin beneath my left eye. A reminder, perhaps, or a warning. The mansion above us groaned, ancient timbers cracking as the crew's magic began to collapse. "We need to get out!" the peacock woman, now just Anna Roberts, shouted over the chaos. "This place is coming down!" The leader howled, his form dissolving into a writhing mass of bone and shadow. The first mask on the pedestal shattered, releasing a wave of energy that sent us stumbling toward the passage. We ran together, climbing over fallen wine racks and up crumbling stairs, the mansion disintegrating around us. We burst out onto the street just as dawn's first light crept over the French Quarter. Behind us, the Beauchamp house collapsed in on itself, taking with it the remains of the crew and their terrible masks. But as I touched the small piece of mask still embedded in my skin, I knew some things couldn't be completely undone. Some dances never truly end. They just change partners, change rhythm, waiting for the next generation to take the floor. The music called to me through the fog, a familiar melody that pulled at my bones. I followed it down Dauphine Street, my trumpet case growing heavier with each step. The traditional sounds of Just a Closer Walk with Thee floated through the mist, but something about the way the notes lingered felt wrong, as if they were being played through molasses. The fog shouldn't have been there at all. New Orleans gets its share of mist from the Mississippi, but this was different. It hung thick and gray, swallowing the streetlights until they were nothing but dim halos in the darkness. The rich aromas of crawfish etouffee and bubbling gumbo drifted from dark restaurant windows, but they turned sickly sweet as they mixed with the underlying stench of decay. My footsteps echoed oddly against the wet cobblestones, each click seeming to come a half-second too late. Somewhere in the distance, an accordion wheezed out a zydeco rhythm that seemed to play backward, the notes bending wrong in the heavy air. I heard them before I saw them, the second line, moving slow and steady through the gloom. The brass section first, their notes weaving together in that familiar funeral march. A trombone wailed a harmony that made my skin prickle. Something about it reminded me of something, a memory that tasted like smoke. Room for one more? My fingers trembled on the trumpet case latch, the music pulling at me like a tide. A clarinetist materialized from the fog, his clothes old-fashioned, the kind you'd see in French Quarter tourist shops trying to capture that vintage New Orleans style. His throat worked against a frayed collar. Always room. His words scraped like sandpaper. Long as you can play. I lifted my trumpet to my lips, and the music flowed through me like muscle memory. But something was wrong. Each note vibrated through my teeth and down my spine, settling in my marrow like ice water. The wrong notes, and there were so many wrong notes now, felt like swallowing broken glass, each one tearing at my insides. When I missed a key change, the fog rushed into my lungs like liquid nitrogen, crystallizing my breath. I fell into step with the procession, adding my voice to the dirge. The fog swirled around us, thick with the sickly sweet perfume of magnolia flowers rotting on the vine, undercut by the heavier stench of decay. For a moment, I could have sworn I saw faces in the mist, hundreds of them, mouths open in silent song. Up ahead, a trombone player faltered, his slide stuttering on a blue note. He lowered his instrument, gasping. "I can't! I need to rest!" The fog condensed around him instantly, no longer mist but something viscous and gray. It forced its way into his mouth, his eyes, his ears. His scream turned liquid, bubbling. When the fog retreated, he was still playing, but his eyes were milky white, and his fingers moved like puppet strings being pulled by unseen hands. The music pouring from his trombone sounded like a man drowning in brass. Time became fluid. We might have been playing for minutes or hours. The streets twisted in impossible ways. I'd played these routes for years, but nothing felt familiar anymore. We'd turn left onto Bourbon, only to end up on streets I'd never seen before, lined with buildings that looked centuries old and somehow wrong, their proportions subtly distorted. We passed Marie Laveau's house of voodoo, where the gris-gris bags in the window seemed to pulse with their own inner light, the glass fogging and clearing in rhythm with our music. A man in a Confederate uniform played bebop on a brass horn that wouldn't be invented for 80 years. Through a window, I glimpsed a jazz club where Buddy Bolden was still playing his first set, the same night his mind finally broke. Around another corner, I saw Louis Prima setting up for a show he wouldn't live to finish. The city's past and future bled together like watercolors in the rain. Other musicians drifted in and out of view. A drummer wearing a Union Army jacket, his sticks moving too fast to follow, playing rhythms that wouldn't be invented for another 50 years. A saxophone player in zoot suit pants and a modern Saints jersey, his instrument gleamed dully, its brass green with age. A woman in a flapper dress played "What a Wonderful World" on her coronet decades before Armstrong would write it. They wore the clothes of every era New Orleans had survived. Antebellum waistcoats, 1920s spats, 1960s tie-dye, modern synthetic fabrics. But their eyes all shared that same hollow look. Some I recognized from photographs in the Jazz Museum. Faces of those lost in the rhythm club fire of 40. Musicians who never made it out of the French Opera House blaze in 1919. Players claimed by the waters of Katrina. Each one carrying their own tragedy in the slump of their shoulders, the tilt of their instruments. The melodies began to overlap, decades of jazz bleeding into each other. I heard ragtime mixing with bebop, funeral marches tangling with blues. Each new layer added to the cacophony until my head throbbed, the discordant notes scraping against my skull like rusty nails. But I couldn't stop playing. My lips burned, splitting and healing and splitting again, while my lungs felt scorched with every breath. The taste of ash coated my tongue, thick and permanent, like I was still breathing smoke from that night. Worse, I could feel my fingertips wearing away against the valve caps, skin thinning with each press until I was sure I must be leaving bloody prints on the brass. Still, the music demanded more. How long? The words caught between phrases, my bleeding lips barely able to form them. The clarinetist's head swayed like a broken metronome. His next words floated out with his rancid breath. "Time ain't the same here. You'll learn." That's when I heard it, cutting through the chaos of sound, a melody I recognized. It was St. James Infirmary Blues, but played the way Beauregard used to play it. Beauregard, who'd taught me everything I knew about jazz. Beauregard, who'd been on stage that night at... The memory hit me like a punch to the gut. Smoke, screaming, the crush of bodies trying to escape, the sound of breaking glass, and I stumbled, my trumpet letting out a discordant wail. The fog seemed to thicken, and in its swirling depths, I saw flames dancing. The other musicians played on, their music growing more frenzied, more desperate. And underneath it all, I could hear voices, thousands of them, overlapping, crying, begging. The clarinetist's face crumbled like old parchment, decades of decay suddenly visible in the fog. "Welcome to the second line." Maggots squirmed in the corners of his mouth. "You'll be with us a long time." The fog closed in, and I realized with growing horror that I couldn't remember how to leave the procession. My feet moved on their own, keeping time with the endless parade. And somewhere in the distance, I heard Beauregard's horn, playing that same haunting melody over and over and over. The truth came in fragments, like broken glass catching streetlight. Each note I played shook loose another memory, another piece of that night at the Maple Leaf Bar. Beauregard's fingers traced the burn marks on his trumpet. "You're rushing it, kid. Jazz ain't about getting there fast. It's about the journey." He'd been teaching me for 15 years by then, since I was a scrawny 13-year-old who could barely hold a trumpet. Back when I still went by Tommy, before he dubbed me Flash. Partly for my quick fingering, partly because I was always trying to race through solos. I remembered the first time he let me sit in with his band. How he'd stepped back during When the Saints Go Marching In, giving teenage me the lead while he played harmony. Remembered him slipping me gig money even when I messed up, saying, "A working musician's gotta eat." He'd co-signed my first car loan, attended my mother's funeral, been the closest thing to a father I'd known since Dad died in Desert Storm, and I'd been trying to pay it forward. Camille, this fierce 16-year-old girl with calloused fingers and hungry eyes, had been begging me for lessons for months. That night was supposed to be her first time performing in public. Just one song, I'd promised her. Last set of the night. She'd been practicing for weeks, her parents sitting proudly in the front row. The journey. Like this endless procession through streets that shouldn't exist. How long have I been here? My lips had gone beyond raw. They were pulp now, each note drawn from them feeling like a razor slice. The valves stuck to my fingerprints with something wet that might have been blood. My mouth tasted of copper and ash, an eternal reminder of that final breath I'd taken in the living world. But I couldn't stop playing. The clarinetist's head snapped toward me, skin gray as cigarette ash, eyes sunken deep into rotting sockets. "You know when?" His jaw clicked with each word. Same night we all joined. The fire had started small. Someone said faulty wiring in the walls. By the time anyone noticed, the smoke was already thick enough to taste. I remembered dropping my trumpet, remembered pushing through the crowd toward the exit. I remembered exactly who I pushed past. Old Miss Marie at the bar, her arthritis-twisted fingers clutching her cane. Emmanuel, the new bass player, tangled in his instrument strap. Little Camille, her borrowed trumpet still gripped tight in her hands, calling my name in confusion as I shoved past her. Her parents reaching for her through the smoke. I hadn't looked back, not even when I heard Beauregard calling my name, not even when I heard Camille's scream cut short. "Flash!" Beauregard had shouted, the last time anyone would call me by that nickname. "Help me get them out!" But I was already running, the remembered praise of all those years turning to ash in my mouth. Behind me, I heard him trying to guide people toward the exit, his voice strong and sure even as the flames spread. "This way, follow my voice." The music around me shifted, becoming something darker. Each instrument seemed to scream with human voices. In the fog, shapes moved, dancers maybe, or lost souls, their bodies twisting in an eternal performance. And there, just at the edge of vision, I caught glimpses of familiar faces. Camille, still 16, her trumpet melted into her hands. Miss Marie limping in an endless circle. Emmanuel, his bass strings threaded through his flesh like stitches. "Beauregard?" My voice cracked like a broken reed. "Beauregard, I'm sorry." Sorry for wasting the gift he'd given me. Sorry for betraying everything he'd taught me about music, about life, about being there for others. Sorry for leaving Camille, who'd trusted me to guide her into this world of music, who'd looked up to me the same way I'd once looked up to him. The clarinetist's laugh splintered like rotting wood. "We're all sorry, kid. That's why we're here. The guilty ones, the ones who left others behind." His yellowed fingers gestured toward a saxophone player who was edging toward the periphery of the group, trying to slip away into a side alley. "Watch." The musician made a break for it, his saxophone clattering to the cobblestones. He made it 3 steps before the fog hardened around him like a chrysalis. We all heard the crack of bone as his body was twisted back toward the procession. When the fog peeled away, he was playing again, but his neck was turned completely backward, his fingers bent at impossible angles against the keys. His eyes met mine as he passed, silently screaming behind a face frozen in an eternal grin. "Can't leave until you're forgiven," the clarinetist said. "And you can't be forgiven until you're truly sorry. Most of us, we're still too selfish, still making excuses. The fog knows. Another figure emerged from the fog, a tall man with a trumpet, his clothes singed around the edges. Beauregard. His eyes met mine, and I saw decades of pain reflected there. I thought I made it out. The words tasted like ashes in my mouth as the truth finally crystallized. I thought I survived. Beauregard's head shook slowly, his neck creaking like old floorboards. Smoke got you 2 blocks away. Been playing with us ever since, but you didn't want to remember. None of us do at first. The music swelled around us. A century of guilt and regret poured into melody. I could hear them all now. Every musician who'd ever left someone behind. Every performer who'd saved themselves at others' expense. Their memories flooded through me. The upstairs lounge in '73, the way the flames had eaten through the stairs while the band played on. The Halloween night when the Waters Club collapsed in '54. Saxophone players still clutching their horns as the floor gave way. The Orpheum Theater panic of 1921, when musicians got caught in the crush of bodies. Modern tragedies mixed with ancient ones. Bush-era jazz clubs crumbling next to Storyville parlors burning. All of us trapped in this eternal parade of the damned, playing songs that hadn't been written yet alongside melodies long forgotten. There's gotta be a way out. Desperation made my notes sharp and jarring. Each wrong note sent the fog curling around my fingers like barbed wire, leaving frost-burned welts that healed just in time for the next mistake. Some way to make it right. Beauregard's feet dragged across the cobblestones as he moved closer, his lowered trumpet dripping condensation. There is, but it costs everything. You have to give up the music, give up the pretense that you deserve to keep playing after what we did. And you have to mean it, really mean it. I've seen musicians try to fake redemption. His gnarled finger pointed toward a figure in the fog I hadn't noticed before, a man fused with his tuba, brass tubes threading through his flesh like veins, his cheeks eternally puffed in an endless note. Beauregard's lips pulled back from blackened teeth. The fog doesn't appreciate lying. I thought about that night again, about the people I'd pushed past to reach the door, about Beauregard, staying behind to help others even as the flames spread, about Camille, who would never get to play her first real gig, whose parents had come to see their daughter shine and instead watched her burn, about the weight of 20 years thinking I'd survived when I'd actually just been running from the truth. The worst part wasn't that I'd left them. It was that I'd failed everything Beauregard had tried to teach me about what it meant to be not just a musician, but a member of this community. Jazz is family, he always said. We lift each other up. Instead, I'd knocked them down to save myself. My trumpet felt heavy in my hands. Around us, the other musicians played on, trapped in their own endless performances. But for the first time since joining the procession, I understood what I had to do. I lowered my horn. The silence cut through the fog like a blade through silk, and the very foundations of the French Quarter seemed to shudder. One by one, other musicians noticed, their endless melodies faltering. The cobblestones beneath our feet began to crack, decades-old moss and centuries of guilt crumbling away. In the distance, St. Louis Cathedral's bells began to toll, though it was neither dawn nor dusk. The trapped saxophone player with his backward head stopped mid-note. The tuba player's brass veins began to unknit from his flesh. The woman fused to her flute, let her fingers slip from the keys. All around us, instruments clattered to the ground like rain. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "I don't deserve the music, not after what I did." A tremor ran through the quarter. The fog began to thin, but as it dissipated, it carried voices, hundreds of them, thousands, every musician trapped in this eternal parade, finding their true voice at last. Not in brass or woodwind or percussion, but in pure human song. I heard Camille's clear soprano rising above the rest, finally getting her solo. Miss Marie's rich contralto, strong and sure without her cane. Emmanuel's deep bass, free from the strings that had bound him. The very air seemed to shimmer as the buildings around us flickered between past and present, settling finally into their true forms. The fog rolled back like a curtain, revealing stars above New Orleans for the first time in what felt like centuries. Beauregard smiled, and for a moment he looked young again, like the man who'd first taught me to play. Behind him, I could see others emerging from the fog, all those who'd been trapped here, their instruments fallen forgotten to the ground, their voices joining in a harmony more perfect than any we'd managed in life. "The song ends for everyone eventually," he said softly. "You just have to be brave enough to let it go, and sometimes one person's courage awakens it in others." The second line began to fade, not into nothingness, but into something else. Pure light maybe, or pure sound, the boundary between the two blurring. The musicians who had been trapped for decades, centuries even, dissolved like morning mist, their faces peaceful at last. In the distance, I heard what might have been the start of a new song, one played not on earthly instruments, but sung by freed souls in perfect harmony. I felt a lightness in my chest, a release of something I'd been holding onto for far too long. The weight of guilt, of regret, of brass and music and memory, all falling away like autumn leaves. Beauregard held out his hand. "Come on, kid. Time for us both to stop playing." I took his hand, and together, we walked into the silence that waited beyond the music. Behind us, our instruments lay abandoned on the cracked cobblestones, slowly being reclaimed by the city we'd haunted for so long. And as we faded, I heard it. One last perfect chord, sung by 1,000 freed voices, echoing through a French quarter that would never quite sound the same again.